Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the 9th in a series of programs I'm doing on the American wisdom writer Ralph Waldo Emerson. My last 2 programs dealt with Emerson's views on religion, especially organized religion. This program will continue with that theme. Emerson was a very spiritual person who stimulates our thinking about what it means to be spiritual and what it means to be truly religious. As I pointed out in previous programs, Emerson, who had been a Unitarian minister at one time, later resigned from the ministry and became a persistent critic of organized religion. My purpose in this series is not to persuade you to Emerson's point of view, but rather to stimulate your thinking. Indeed, that was Emerson's purpose in writing, in lecturing, to stimulate people's thinking. Emerson claimed that people often confuse the truth of God with the word of man. When priests, rabbis, imams, ministers preach, how much of what they say represents God's view, God's mind, assuming there is a God, and how much of what they preach represents their own views and their own interpretation of God's mind. Emerson was a student of comparative religion. He studied the world's great religions and came to embrace ecumenism. Emerson believed there were important truths in all the major religions, but none of the religions was perfect. Emerson also claimed that there is no certainty in religion, but that holy books such as the Bible, the Hindu holy book, the Bhagavad Gita, the Islamic holy book, the Quran, are all important books because they can stimulate our thinking in significant ways. For Emerson, the important question was not, what can I know, since he believed there are few things that we can know with certainty. Indeed, he said this, and I'm quoting him, very often, knowledge is the knowing that we cannot know. So again, he wasn't so interested in the question, what can I know, as the questions, how shall I live, how shall I behave? Emerson's emphasis was on ethics and not religious dogma, which he believed was often of questionable truth. Last week, I raised the question, assuming God exists, can anyone know with certainty the mind of God? And I quoted Voltaire, the famous 18th century French intellectual, who, like Emerson, was a critic of organized religion. Voltaire criticized the clergy who claimed to know God's mind with certainty. And here are Voltaire's own words. It is only charlatans who are certain. Doubt is not a very agreeable state, but certainty is a ridiculous one. By the way, this is not an argument against religion or the existence of God. Simply because one cannot be certain of something does not mean it's not true. Indeed, Voltaire, like Emerson, was a critic of organized religion, but nevertheless claimed he did believe in God. More on this a little bit later in the program. Last week I also raised the question, what usually determines a person's religion? And I mentioned that many scholars claim that in one way or another, geography determines a person's religion. How so? Well, if the Pope had been born and raised in Saudi Arabia by Muslim parents, what are the chances that today he would be the Pope? And if Muslim leaders had been born and raised in Italy by Catholic parents, what are the chances that today they would be Muslim leaders? And if Jewish rabbis had been born and raised in Japan by Buddhist parents, again, what are the chances that today they would be Jewish rabbis? What did Emerson have to say about Jesus Christ? I mentioned Emerson was a Protestant minister for some years. Well, here are Emerson's own words. Jesus Christ belonged to the true race of prophets. But what a distortion did his doctrine and memory suffer in the following ages. Emerson is not alone among famous thinkers in believing that Jesus' teachings have been distorted and misunderstood. Few scholars have studied the Bible with the degree of scholarship and diligence of Albert Schweitzer. I've mentioned Schweitzer in previous programs. He was arguably the greatest humanitarian of the 20th century. Schweitzer was a European who became a medical doctor and went to Africa and spent more than 30 years in Africa treating the poorest of the poor. What many people don't know about Schweitzer is that besides being a medical doctor, he had a PhD in philosophy. Indeed, he had been a professor of philosophy in Europe before becoming a medical doctor. He also had a degree in theology, and like Emerson, had been a minister at one time. Indeed, Schweitzer had several careers. Again, at one time a minister, at another time a professor of philosophy, and then a medical doctor, and also he was a well-known concert organist. In any event, Schweitzer studied the Bible and came to these conclusions after years of research on Jesus and the Bible. And here are Schweitzer's own words. Again, Albert Schweitzer's own words. Jesus does not think dogmatically. He formulates no doctrine. Nowhere does Jesus insist that his hearers sacrifice thinking to believing. Again, nowhere does Jesus demand, that's the word Schweitzer uses, nowhere does Jesus demand that his hearers sacrifice thinking to believing. Quite the contrary. Jesus bids his followers to reflect on religion. Schweitzer continues, and these are his own words. The truth that the ethical is the essence of religion is firmly established on the authority of Jesus. What Schweitzer is saying, in short, is that Jesus was all about ethics, not dogma. That as far as Jesus was concerned, how we behave is far more important than what we believe. That it's not very important that we believe in the Trinity or the virgin birth or even the resurrection of Jesus. How we behave, again, according to Schweitzer, far more important than what we believe. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, one of the most famous of all philosophers, who lived in the 18th century and is regarded by many as the father of modern philosophers, said this about religion, or I should say, he directed his thoughts and his writings in this direction. Kant attempted to change the basis of religion from theology to morals, from creeds to conduct. Again, Kant attempted to change the emphasis in religion from creed to conduct. Kant claimed that if a religion made belief more important, made belief more important than behavior, then that religion really no longer qualified to be called a religion. So again, Kant, like Schweitzer, was of the opinion that how we behave is far more important than what we believe. A more recent writer on this subject is Professor Gary Wills, who wrote a rather well-known book some years ago entitled What Jesus Meant. Wills was also a professor of Greek at one time, and indeed read the New Testament in the original Greek. Wills, by the way, is a devout Catholic, again, who's done extensive research on the Bible. And here's the conclusion that Professor Gary Wills has come to. He says that Jesus tells us, in his own words, how one becomes a follower of Jesus. And here are Jesus' words. This is from John 13. All will know that you are my followers by this sign alone, that you have love for one another. Again, these are Jesus' own words. All will know that you are my followers by this sign alone, that you have love for one another. Wills goes on to say that Jesus is not talking about some kind of sentimental, dreamy, gushy love. No, when Jesus talks about love, he's talking about compassion and justice. The idea is if we truly love our fellow human beings, we will have compassion for them and we will treat them justly. According to Professor Wills, love is the test of whether one is a genuine Christian. Again, love is the test as to whether one is a genuine Christian. How we treat others is the test. St. Paul provides some elaboration on this theme. In Corinthians 13, St. Paul says this, and I'm quoting him: 3 things matter: believing, hoping, and loving. But loving is supreme. In other words, loving people is more important than believing everything your religion teaches. Professor Wills goes on to say that Jesus believed in an inner religion. Jesus called authentic only the religion of the heart. This religion called for a radical cleansing of the heart, not to be achieved by externals. Jesus' kind of love is all about self-conquest. It's about conquering our tendencies towards self-centeredness and self-absorption. It's about conquering whatever hatred and anger is in us. And also, since Jesus believed that true love involves a cleansing of the heart, Jesus believed that if we were to become good lovers, we had to cultivate compassion and kindness. Wills quotes Jesus on some religious obligations. Jesus, as you might recall, in the New Testament, talks about the importance of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and tending to the sick. Indeed, Jesus in Matthew 25 says the following: "In truth, I tell you, whenever you do these things to the lowliest of my brothers, you do these things to me." Jesus went on to say, "And whenever you failed to do these things," again, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, tending to the sick, "whenever you failed to do these things to the least of my brothers, you failed to do them to me." The best explanation of religious duties I've ever come across comes from Thomas Paine, a very famous American revolutionary, a contemporary of Jefferson and Franklin. You might recall Thomas Paine wrote what is considered by many to be the most famous pamphlet in American history. It was called Common Sense, and it was an argument at the time in the 1770s for America to rebel against England and declare its independence. But Paine, Thomas Paine, on the subject of religious duties, said this: "I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow human creatures happy." Let me say that again. Again, this is the best explanation of religious duties I've ever come across. I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow human creatures happy. Can you think of a better test to determine if one is truly religious? So many of the famous thinkers in history have said there are at least several ways to be religious. Tolstoy, for example, the great Russian novelist, has one of his characters in one of his novels claim there is an intelligent way to be religious and also an unintelligent way to be religious. And Gordon Allport, who taught psychology at Harvard many years ago, wrote a book entitled The Individual and His Religion, in which he distinguishes between mature religious believers and immature religious believers. And according to Professor Allport, who again was a psychologist, what is the difference? Well, he claimed that maturely religious people have deep beliefs, but they don't claim to be certain about their beliefs, and they will consider evidence that runs counter to their beliefs. In this context, I think if Professor Allport were alive today, he would consider the Dalai Lama, the head of Tibetan Buddhism, or the leader, I should say, of Tibetan Buddhism, to be a maturely religious person. How so? Well, the Dalai Lama recently was asked this question: what if science proves certain Buddhist beliefs to be wrong? What will you do? And the Dalai Lama paused and then said this: well, if science proves some of our religious beliefs to be wrong, we'll have to change some of our beliefs. According to Professor Allport, what is an immature? What are the characteristics, I should say? What are the characteristics of an immature religious believer? Well, according to Professor Allport, an immature religious believer is someone who has deep beliefs, but unlike the mature believer, is certain, absolutely certain of his or her beliefs, and will not consider any evidence that runs counter to those beliefs. I suspect that both Tolstoy and Professor Allport would have considered Blaise Pascal to have been a mature religious believer. And who was Blaise Pascal? Well, if you've watched many of my previous programs, you know that he was a 17th century mathematician, very famous mathematician, by the way, but also a very devout Catholic. And Pascal said this about religion and the Bible, and I'm quoting him: "It is the heart which perceives God and not the reason. That is what faith is, God perceived by the heart and not reason." Pascal deeply believed that Jesus Christ was God, but that the Bible doesn't prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jesus was God. In other words, Pascal, a deep believer in Christianity, did claim there was no certainty. Indeed, Pascal is very well known for what today is called Pascal's wager. In his most famous book called Pensées, meaning thoughts, it's the French translation of thought, a book I highly recommend to you, by the way, Pascal said this to his readers. He said, "Even though we cannot be certain that Jesus was God and that the Bible is an exact record of what Jesus said and did, gamble that it's true. Again, make a wager that it's true." And Pascal said, if you make this wager that Jesus was God and the Bible is the Word of God, you have everything to gain and nothing to lose. What do you think about that? While I do believe that Tolstoy and Allport would have agreed with so much of what Blaise Pascal said about religion and Christianity in particular, I don't know if they would have agreed with Pascal's wager. And back to Emerson. According to Ralph Waldo Emerson, how does one go about being religious? Well, you recall, he talked about self-reliance in contrast to reliance on a clergy person. You recall that Emerson believed we don't need priests, ministers, imams, or rabbis to be religious. He believed we should rely on our intuition. We should listen to our own inner voice, and that will tell us a lot about religion. Here are his own words, Emerson's own words. "The truth of religion is an intuition. It cannot be received at second hand. Truly speaking, it is not instruction, but provocation that I can receive from another soul. What he announces, what this other soul announces, I must find true in me or reject." So again, Emerson is saying, what the priest, the minister, the rabbi, or imam tells me, I must find true in me or reject. Emerson went on to say this: God is to be discovered by each person in his soul and not in books or church councils. Again, Emerson's own words. God is to be discovered by each person in his soul and not in books, holy books, for example, or church councils. Emerson talked about the religion of the heart in contrast to the religion of churches, mosques, and temples. And again, his own words. God builds his temple in the heart on the ruins of churches and religions. Emerson went on to say that we do not need formal religions because we are born believing. Emerson believed we are all born with a religious impulse. According to Emerson, how does one know if one is truly religious? Well, his own words. A true conversion to God is to be made by the reception of beautiful sentiments. Again, a true conversion to God is to be made by the reception of beautiful sentiments. The idea is one's heart brimming with compassion, kindness, and a commitment to treat others justly? And again, if one's heart is brimming with compassion and kindness and a commitment to treat other people justly, that is evidence that one is a truly religious human being. What do you think about Emerson's approach to religion? Some would argue with Emerson that we do need organized religion. Don't many people need some kind of religious or spiritual guidance? Indeed, Benjamin Franklin, who himself was not very religious, who rarely went to church, did believe that churches, mosques, and temples were very valuable because other people did need formal religious guidance. Also, doesn't the very architecture of many churches, mosques, and temples pitch us to higher levels of awareness? I know that when I often travel, especially when I'm in Spain, I will sometimes go to a church at around 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on a weekday afternoon. There is no service in progress, and I will sit in the church, and I find that the architecture of the church, and also the music, at some of the Spanish churches I go to, there is recorded music all day, and I find that just being in the church, even though no service is going on, helps to pitch me to a higher level of spirituality. I wonder if any of you have experienced this. Next week, I will finish up with my segment on Emerson and religion. But right now, as is my custom, I'd like to conclude with a quotation from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, as you know, believed that we are all artists. And in Walden, his masterpiece, he penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."